Today's topic is concussions in baseball. This is an extremely important topic and one that often does not get mentioned about in baseball players. We usually hear about shoulder injuries such as rotator cuff or elbow injuries such as the ulnar collateral ligament or the Tommy John ligament. We often hear about muscle injuries, hamstring and quad injuries, and often about knee pain, meniscus tears, and tendonitis. But today we will talk about concussions in baseball. We will start with a couple of case scenarios and decide what to do. Then we will go over the definition of concussion, how long will it take to recover, we'll review risk factors, we'll go over treatment, and finally what is the appropriate return to play or return to the playing field. And we will also talk about preventative strategies for preventing concussion. Often a batter will be hit by a pitch in the helmet and they'll fall to the ground, and a coach or an athletic trainer will ask, "How are you doing?" When we say, "When in doubt, sit them out," which means if we suspect there's a concussion, then that player should not play the rest of the game, and ideally they should sit in a quiet part of the stadium or the stands or be taken home. A second scenario would be a pitcher is hit by a line drive and they get confused or they stagger. And again, when in doubt, they should be removed from the game. The third scenario, which I've witnessed many times, is that a middle infielder or a third baseman or a first baseman goes to field a ground ball and they get hit in the head and they stagger and don't look right. In all three scenarios, these are probable concussions. So what is the definition of a concussion? It's a trauma to the head, neck, shoulder, or chest that results in symptoms, but you must have altered mental status, which means baseball player would feel confused, they would be forgetful. So if a baseball player gets hit in the head and they just have a headache, that's not a concussion. They have to be confused or feel foggy or have some physical feature such as a loss of balance or an eye tracking problem. So once a baseball player has a concussion, how do we treat them? We start by doing relative rest. They should be removed from the game, and ideally they should not go to school the next day or go to work the next day. They should sleep in. And what we've learned over the past 20 years, that too much rest, meaning putting that baseball player in a bubble doing nothing for 2 to 3 days, can prolong recovery. Also, letting them watch too much TV or letting them watch the rest of a doubleheader can also prolong symptoms. But we have to tailor the treatment based on the athlete and the circumstances. What are the risk factors for prolongation of a concussion? Before we get into that, we have to know statistics. So 60% of baseball players who suffer from a concussion will heal and totally recover in 2 weeks or less. About 90% will heal at 3 weeks, but at 4 weeks, 5 to 10% will linger on with symptoms. How do we know who's going to suffer from a prolonged concussion? The risk factors include a history of prior concussion in the previous year, a history of attention deficit disorder, a history of headaches or migraine headaches, and finally a learning disability. All of these pre-existing factors will likely lead to a prolongation of a concussion. So when they suffer a concussion, we try to remove most electronics. We try to remove them from physical stimuli as well as cognitive or learning stimuli. What we do know is that the vitamin B2 and magnesium, or MigraLeaf, which is an over-the-counter supplement, can help restore the cognitive problems or the fogginess. So this should be done right away. Who should go to the emergency room? Those who have lost consciousness or have a neurological finding such as blurred vision or double vision or inability to stand on one leg. Who should get a CAT scan or a special x-ray of the head? Those who have lost consciousness, those who have significant altered mental status, meaning they don't know what happened right before the concussion or they don't know what happened right after the concussion. What if the baseball player does not recover at 2-3 weeks or even at 4 weeks? What are other strategies or treatment that they can do? Oftentimes, we have to ask where the headache is. Is it in the front of the head or the back of the head? If it's in the back of the head, there's often a muscular component. So physical therapy can often be helpful. In addition, we're learning more about the ocular or the eye movements in athletes who suffer from a concussion. So they can respond to visual training or vestibular training. Vestibular training does involve eye movements, improving the eye movements, but it primarily focuses on improving one's balance. So they may have dizziness or balance difficulty walking up and down stairs. They may have difficulty putting their coat on or brushing their teeth. So these baseball players will require vestibular therapy. It's important to ask the baseball player if they've had prior concussions, and if they have had prior concussions, how long their symptoms took to recover and what were their primary symptoms. Was it a balance problem or a personality problem or a sleep disturbance? So although each concussion and each individual is different, patterns will repeat themselves. So if there was a balance problem initially, we may start the vestibular or the balance therapy right away. So if a baseball player suffers from a concussion during the game, should they continue watching the game? Well, ideally not, but if they're away in another city or in a tournament, they should be removed and put in the stadium or in the stands where it's quiet, or take a car ride to where it is quieter. Once an athlete is symptom-free for at least 24 hours, so symptom-free means no headache, even if it's mild, which means no problems with light sensitivity or sound sensitivity, and they're sleeping well, they can then begin the return to play protocol. Typically, the return to play protocol is a step-by-step fashion which takes 5 stages or 5 steps or 5 days. The first stage would be light to moderate aerobic activity on a bicycle, which would be 20 to 30 minutes of mild to moderate intensity at a bicycle. The second stage would be the same 20 to 30 minutes on a bicycle, and then we would do jogging for 20 to 30 minutes. Stage 3 would be running and doing calisthenics, so doing 20 or 30 push-ups and sit-ups and burpees and lunges and squats. Stage 4 would be to do a light practice, which would entail doing some light hitting and doing some fielding and throwing. And this would be of moderate intensity, a half hour or an hour. And they should do the regular warm-up with the team. Finally, if they pass the light practice, they can then do a full practice. Now, if the baseball player had any symptoms at any of these stages, they should go back to the prior stage. So if light practice induced headache or dizziness, then they should go to stage 3, which is running and calisthenics. If the running and the biking, which is stage 2, created symptoms, then they would go back to the biking. Now, people often ask, can they pre-medicate with Tylenol or Motrin before these stages or after the stages? Well, if we have to pre-medicate, then they're not able to, and they should not continue their return to play protocol. So it is important to individualize each treatment. So we will now review each case scenario. The first case scenario was the batter was hit by a pitch in the head. So what should be done? They should be taken out of the game and ideally home. Should they go to school the next day? Well, they should sleep in and go into school 3 hours later if they're feeling up to it. If they're not feeling up to it, then they can stay out for several days. But it is known that staying out for more than several days will often lead to fatigue and maybe even some depression and social isolation. Case scenario number 2 was a pitcher who was hit in the head by a baseball, and this pitcher was staggering. Just like in the batter who was hit by a pitch, this pitcher should be removed from the playing field. Many parents, many coaches feel uncomfortable sending that athlete home, so they'll tell the parent to go to the emergency department or urgent care, which is perfectly fine. The problem with that is they definitely still need to follow up with the sports medicine physician or their pediatrician to do an adequate assessment of their balance and visual ocular motor movements. Stage 3 was the infielder was going to field a ground ball, and the ball hit him in his head, and they looked dazed. Just like the other two scenarios, this middle infielder should be taken home, or if the parents or the coach want, they can go to urgent care or they can go to the emergency department. But they must be followed up within 1 to 2 days. Now, a couple important points that we have not mentioned, that 90% of concussions, we do recognize the symptoms on day 1. But up to 10% of young athletes, of young baseball players who suffer concussion, we don't recognize their symptoms till 2 to 3 days or even up to a week later. So they could be perfectly fine, even finish the game, but then the next day in the game they start getting headaches, or the next day in school, after reading, they get headaches and difficulty concentrating. Now, one key feature, if we're able to do this, is to ask the parents and the teammates or the coach, is there any personality change? Normally, this pitcher, maybe he is very outgoing and now he's withdrawn, so that would be a personality change, even though the pitcher says he is perfectly fine. So we have to get the input of all of the people involved who work with the pitcher or with the baseball player. So to summarize, we've gone over the definition of a concussion. We have to have a cognitive feature, which means feeling dazed or confused or being forgetful. The majority of concussions do heal in 2 weeks or less, but we know that there are many rehab strategies if the athlete takes more than 2 to 3 weeks to heal, such as physical therapy or balance therapy, and sometimes they need to meet with a neuropsychologist. It's also important not to, quote, rest for a week and then go play in a game. We have to do the return to play protocol, which is a step-by-step fashion, which is 5 stages. First is biking, stage 2 is running and biking, stage 3 running and calisthenics, stage 4 is light practice, and stage 5 is a full practice. So the athlete must be symptom-free with all of these stages in order to play in a game. So these are the general principles when looking at a baseball player who has suffered a concussion. We need the input of many physicians, a sports medicine physician or a neurologist, and the pediatrician in order to get that athlete symptom-free and returning to the field symptom-free and performing at a high level.